was a 33-leg trip, and they made it through like leg 31. This is like leg 29. But they look good. They look like they like each other. Okay. So and they seem very confident. So this is me. So I have a weird hobby. I came up with the Antique Wireless Association ranks. I've been a ham for 2 years, but I like radios, and I really like. I'll try not to come on. But anyway, I love finding a radio that turns out to have a unique story. Either who used to actually own this radio, or the type of radio that was used by somebody. Okay, it triggers, I could Google things, I get this up at night and change email people, and I have cards like this too. So if you have a weird radio laying around that you know nothing about, send me a picture of it, and maybe it'll trigger something. This is the radio that triggered my interest. I knew vaguely about Amelia Earhart and Fred Nooning, but about 4 years ago, a friend of mine bought this radio from a Silent Keys estate down in Atlanta, Georgia. I think it was Marty Reynolds. I don't know if anybody knew him, and it didn't have a data plate on it. So and nobody really knew what it was. So, but I bought it sight unseen and said sure, and it was missing an IF. Somebody had messed with one of the IF cans, so it wasn't working at the time. But we took care of all that, and you can see this one has a data plate. We actually got a data plate and made a replica and all that kind of stuff. But so this is a RCA AR60 receiver. It's really a weird receiver. They only made a couple hundred of them, and it turns out the Coast Guard got quite a few of them. And Pan Am Airlines got quite a few of them. And I didn't know that until I started researching Pan Am Airlines about something else. But there's a lot of common points between the Amelia Earhart story and Pan Am. But very expensive radio for 1935 as well. So, and here's a picture of a Coast Guard ship. Circa 1937, and there's actually two of those in the left and the rightmost receiving stations there. If you can see them, they have like a dual tuning arrangement. Megacycles is one of them, and kilocycles is the other. So you have to use two hands to set frequency. So it's pretty bizarre, actually. And so the next thing that happened was I found out that there was a ship called the Itasca that was involved with the disappearance of Amelia and Fred, and they had AR-60s on here. They actually had the Coast Guard variant, Coast Guard receiver 32-1, okay? And it has a couple extra components on it, but basically it's a AR-60. Quite a good receiver, but actually one of the conspiracy theories of about 20 years ago was the thought was that why couldn't Amelia and the Itasca, which was sitting at Howland Island, which was the place where she was supposed to land, why couldn't they make two-way communication? Well, one of the theories was that the AR-60s were no good. So they actually found one and ran it through. In fact, they borrowed it from the Antique Wireless Museum up in New York, and they tested it, and they said it's a great receiver. So we have to scratch that theory, okay? And you can see here's a map of I think this was leg 32 when she took off at Ley, New Guinea, and was going to fly to Howland Island, and you can see the little Itasca sitting out there, okay? And this also kind of gives you scale of some of the other places that probably just that's good. You know, some of the one group says she ended up here on Gardner Island. Another group says they ran out of gas right up here. Another group said she ended over here and was captured by the Japanese. So this kind of gives you the miles. Did she have enough gas to get here? Did she have enough gas to get over there? So,
and I'll talk about some of that. Let's see if I put this back on. Okay. Okay. The other thing, I found the one radio, and I was talking to a ham buddy of mine in Oregon, and I said, wouldn't it be great if we could find the transmitter that Amelia Earhart had on her plane, which was a Western Electric Model 13C, 3-channel, 50-watt AM transmitter. Hers was actually modified for Morse code as well, but the stock was AM first, because they were right at that edge where pilots wanted to talk. They didn't want to send Morse code, okay? They wanted to fly the plane and talk. They didn't want to be the radio operator. So it was, well, he says, oh, I've got one. And I said, oh, you do? And he says, yeah, let me look in my storage buildings. Took him 6 months, okay? But he did have one. And he sends me another email, says, well, if you'll pay shipping from Oregon, you can have it. And of course, I was wetting my pants. Okay, so and here it is. And this was where we were showing it at the Charlotte Ham Fest in our booth display. So it's an interesting transmitter. You can see it down here in Amelia's plane, down here in the bottom right-hand corner, and look at all the gas tanks in that aircraft. So yeah. So there's 4 main theories of what happened to Amelia. She just ran out of gas, crashed, and sank. Okay. Some people says she had enough gas that they were spying on the Japanese, and she had extra gas and made it to Saipan and captured. And well, some people think that. There's one book that was written that said Amelia came back to the United States and lived out her life under an assumed name. Okay. I don't think that was a big seller, but it's out there. And then there's another group that says she made it to Gardner Island, landed, kind of crash landed, and transmitted while there, and died as castaways. Okay? Now, I've got some books with me. This is the book of a group called Nauticos, and they have Google money behind them. They've spent $5 or $6 million so far searching in the deep water northeast of Howland Island. They're the group that says she ran out of gas and she just went into the drink. Smithsonian concurs with that. They say that's what we think happened as well. Okay? So there's a book for that. And here's basically where they say it happens. I think this is Howland Island right here, and so it says they kind of went over, they kind of missed it because they flew at night, and then they started zigzagging, and then they basically ran out of gas right here. So that's where they're searching, and it's expensive to search in deep water, and they haven't found the plane yet. And the reason, and they're just basing that on received transmissions. So, if they flew on and didn't say anything, or if nobody heard a transmission, then that theory is kaput, okay?
Who's received transmission? Who's received?
Anybody. And anybody. It's really what the Itasca received, but you'll get into it. A lot of people received a lot of things at different times, and so there's been a lot of correlation of that too. But this is really based on the, well, see, there was some bogus. I'll get to that. Hold that thought. Now, both that receiver and the transmitter are now in the hands of Rod Blockstone, K0DAS. He's the guy on the left. And we had an antique wireless meet in March in Charlotte, and I'm the meet chairman, and I had Rod come talk about his theory about Amelia Earhart. Well, he saw my receiver, my Coast Guard receiver, and my transmitter, and he wet his pants. And what he wants, and he's a retired Collins engineer, and he's also the Midwest ARRL director. So he's very credible, and he wants to power up the transmitter, look at the characteristics, see if it really sends out a lot of harmonics, because harmonics are involved in this too. Okay, and by the way, the speaker on the right was another ham friend of mine named Hiroki Kato, Dr. Hiroki Kato. He was born in Hiroshima in 1942. And he was talking about a British Paraset clandestine World War II radio that he built a replica of, but he also had a real one with him. So we had some interesting talk. So here's a newspaper article that says that the Japanese had Amelia and executed her on Saipan. Okay, and there's if you go on YouTube, you can actually hear Marines say they saw her on Saipan. She was killed on Saipan. I mean, there's for every one of these theories, there's great what do you call that evidence? Thank you. And yep. There's also the Marshall Islands put out a set of stamps in 1987 that show her taking off at New Guinea, shows the Itasca out there, and then it shows her landing in the Marshall Islands, which is basically Saipan, and a Japanese ship picking up the plane and carting them off. And the press didn't say a thing. Okay, the press doing, huh? And of course there's a book for that. So there's hundreds of books about Amelia, by the way. So now, how many people saw the special in the last 6 months about History Channel? You know, I watched it, and I was almost taken in. They were showing a prison cell, and they said, just think, Amelia was here for 6 months, and da-da-da-da-da. Well, and a lot of it was based on the fact that this picture had showed up. Well, like 3 days after that History Channel special, some teenager in Japan found this brochure published in a tourism guide 2 years prior to, so it just kind of blew the whole thing, okay? So that's kind of what happens. Just something pops up and then boom, you know, it most of the time it just blows up. So here's the book that talks about Amelia coming back as a lady called Irene Boland, okay? Now, you have to look at the picture, you know, and I like this little thing down here, you know. I don't know what to think. And I really don't know what to think on that one. So, but if you want to think that, there's a book for that. Now, the most credible group, in my humble opinion, is this TGAR group, International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery. They're not only searching for Amelia, but that's been their #1 focus. Right now, they're switching to Glenn Miller, you know, the Glenn Miller aircraft, and I think it was because somebody donated some money and said, go find, you know, go verify if that plane that somebody dragged up with a fishing vessel and all that. So not to say that this won't continue on as well, but they've been doing this for like 30 years now, because my slide's a little old, and they spent $5 million, and this group spent $6 million. So I mean, there's a lot of money trying to find this aircraft. But this is a great book. It's got a DVD in the back, lots and lots of anything you want to read, you know, any letter from so-and-so to so-and-so, and it's all there. I mean, he was Rick was a aircraft accident investigator before he formed this group. So.
Is this the group that went to Greenland and found one of those bombers that they were transporting?
No, that was a Georgia Tech guy that actually brought up the P-38. He built the heated top that went down 330 feet. And
330 feet.
Yeah.
In the ice.
Yep. Yep. So this is the best book, and Rick is working on another book. I think it's like Finding Amelia 2. And I've already prepaid for that book, but it's not ready yet. So, and you can still get a copy of this used on Amazon for like $10. It's a great book, and what TGAR says, they say Fred was trying to fly this route, but they think the winds blew him off this way. And again, most of this was at night. Okay, so you know, Fred's a pretty good daytime. Well, he's a pretty good celestial navigator, but you know, it wasn't GPS. And then he ended up on this line, and he was just he knew he was about the right distance, so he was trying to catch it, and that's why they think maybe now Gardner Island is now called Nikumaroro, so that's why the name change here. So they basically say they think that they got to Gardner, they landed, they were able to transmit which means they were able to turn one engine that drove the dynamotor so that they could transmit. And also Pan Am had direction finding capability at Wake and Midway in Hawaii, and they actually triangulated a signal on 3105. They didn't catch the voice, but they a carrier around that time, and it all went to Gardner Island. Okay, but it took a while for this kind of information to evolve and get to the right parties and all that. So I'm going to regress for a second and just talk about Amelia a little bit. How many people have you heard about who they became very, very successful after they had a near-death experience? Okay. Well, Amelia almost died of the flu in 1918. She was a Canadian nurse, 1718, and then she caught I think it was the Spanish flu, and she just about died. But eventually she did recover. And but it's kind of like after that she was sort of she'd been fairly timid before, but after that she was like going to do something significant. So here she is. She's got a female flight instructor. She's at the Curtiss aircraft factory, and she's learning how to fly. And that's around 1920, which is very early. She accomplished, they called her Lady Lindy because she was thin, like Charles Lindbergh, and there was a lot of ads that had them both in there dressed up, But she, in her own right, she did a lot of things. And for example, she was the first person to fly solo between Honolulu and Oakland. In other words, from Hawaii to the States. And she did it on a single engine aircraft too, which is pretty scary. So, but so she was a good flyer, but what she was really, really good at was raising money. Okay, she knew she had to give interviews. She knew she had to do appearances. She knew she had to write. Okay, so she knew that flying was expensive, and I had to, the public side had to be serviced, and she was excellent at that. So the press loved her for it. They'd ask her like, "What sandwich did you have today?" Which used to drive her crazy. She also had her own luggage. Okay, luggage line. She also had her own clothes line. So she was an entrepreneur, way back when. And again, it was all so that she could fly. One thing that most people don't know about is a big way to make money back in the 30s was selling stamped covers to stamp collectors. And she had a deal with Gimbel's, which was a department store that they sold flank covers. Anytime she went anywhere, they, $200, $1,000, whatever they were, and she'd make like $3 a piece on them, which was good money back then. So she was very well tied in with FDR and Eleanor. She had her own week. Okay, so and. She was single at first, but here comes George Palmer Putnam, okay? He's a publisher. He made his money initially by publishing the biography of Charles Lindbergh, going across, first man to fly the Atlantic, right? I forget how much money George Palmer made, like $200,000, but Lindbergh made like close to $1 million, which would be like, many million now. So, and Amy Guest, who was a rich Londoner, she wanted to make sure that a woman got across the Atlantic as soon as other people started doing that. And she actually charged Putnam with finding a candidate, and that's how Amelia went across with an airplane called Friendship in 1928. She was a pilot already, but the two guys that were pilots wouldn't let her actually take the controls, so she sat in the back. But once they made it, the press was just all over her. Didn't really care about the two guys, okay? And then her career was off, and of course then she said, "I'm going to do it myself without these guys." So I just wanted to talk about one of her achievements here. So she, on January 11th, 1935, she becomes the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to California, okay? Which, no big deal now, but it was a big deal then. The other funny thing that happened, She had never seen another plane when she was flying over oceans. She had never seen another plane before. And during this flight, she saw a Pan Am Clipper on a survey flight. They were learning to fly to Hawaii, and then to Midway, then Wake, then and then eventually to the Philippines, into China. And she actually saw them and circled the plane and took a picture of it because it was so unique. She'd never seen anybody else up in the air before. Now, there was a Radiocraft article in April 1935 that actually talked about her radio equipment, which I thought was pretty cool. And there's this switch on this transmitter, and it's on 3105 right now, but it also could go to 6210. So they had two frequencies, and these frequencies were actually for U.S. only. It was like if you were flying from the East Coast to the West Coast, you either used 3105 or 6210. 3105, I think, was your nighttime frequency, and 6210 was your daytime frequency. That's all you needed. And anybody that was on the ground was listening to one of those two. And this was her transmitter here, which was a CW transmitter at the time, by the way. So here's Amelia Earhart with a fellow named Paul Mantz, okay? And if you read this article, I love the title. It says, Amelia Earhart shortwave receiver never failed, okay? And that's pretty cool. But it talks about all the stuff that Paul Mantz did. He tested everything. He bought everything. He made it work. I mean, he was her right arm, but you never hear about the right arms. You always hear about the star, okay? And that's nothing against Amelia. It's true of, we talk about Patton won World War II, and I have a couple of relatives that served under Patton, and, so, but whatever. And you can see the single-engine airplane there. And she had this 250-foot trailing wire that she had to unwind and then wind back in, and pilots didn't like to do that either, by the way. So, and I meant to bring a crank. This is the kind of thing that Paul Mantz did for Amelia. This was the receiver that was on board in that 1935 flight. It's a Western Wireless Type 7 receiver, but you notice it says General Electric right across the front, so I don't know about that. But he actually carved in the plastic cover the actual where to listen to the channels. So, and basically all she had to do when she took off from Hawaii was to tune in one of these very strong California stations and just sit on there and take direction finding. And she actually had a loop in the back, and I think she had to do like this with her plane to actually, it looked like a fixed loop, so she had to move the plane to, so basically she knew she had to go to the east, and it was just a question, are you going to hit Oakland, or are you going to hit, San Francisco, or someplace else. So, but this is the kind of thing. So Paul Mantz was really he was the technical guy. I mean, he was the difference between success and failure. So they called Paul Mantz the Hollywood pilot, and he used to fly a lot of celebrities up to Las Vegas back in the good days. But if you read here, I'd always heard this rumor that somebody bought a whole fleet of aircraft surplus and then drained off the gas, sold the gas, and made more than what the planes cost, and then and the planes were free and clear. And it turns out it was Paul Mantz, okay? And he made films, for the war effort, and but he also see if you recognize this clip. So anybody know what, huh? No? Oh, close though, close.
I actually had that on the
Yeah. 12 o'clock high. And so Paul Mantz did a lot of, for Hollywood. And now, how about this one?
Flying a makeshift aircraft made of aluminium and plywood, veteran stuntman Paul Mantz. He and fellow stuntman Bobby Rose were doubling for James Stewart and Richard Attenborough stars of a new Hollywood picture. The script called for touchdown passes before the camera. But on the third pass, the plane hit the desert and cartwheeled into destruction. Bobby Rose escaped, but Paul Mance was killed instantly. Another camera records the tragedy. Paul Mance spent a lifetime crashing planes to order. He was killed by the crash that wasn't in the script.
Now I heard somebody say it. What was that? Flight of the Phoenix. Yep. And he came out of retirement to do that, by the way. I mean, he was worth millions, and again, the tie-in there is Amelia. You know, this was going to be her round the world flip was going to be her last before she retired too. So everybody always goes for one more, you know. And so as far as the frequencies, 3105 and 6210, they were the standard calling frequencies going across the United States. Okay, there really were no standards internationally, other than what was there for ships, which was basically 500 kilohertz or 333 kilohertz, and VLF, which means long trailing antennas, and CW. They weren't doing AM then, so. And so CW was still the standard too, and Amelia didn't like CW. Okay, and a lot of people didn't. Pan Am pilots went on strike one time because Pan Am was the first to have a flight radio operator. Okay, but at one point they were saying they were going to do away with the flight radio operator and make the pilots do CW. They went on strike. The guys from the big office had to come down and calm everybody's fears. So, and they kept using CW with a flight radio operator for a few more years, and then they put in a low-powered thing so the pilots could talk to the field when they got within 50 miles and that kind of thing. So Amelia, she got a new plane via Purdue University. It's a twin-engine Lockheed Electra. She was a single-engine pilot. She was used to having 12 gauges. This thing had over 100 gauges. Okay, so it was a big step up, and but she was on the staff at Purdue, and her thing was trying to find women in aviation. And here's some of her students that she coached and tutored. With the flying laboratory, everybody wanted to get their equipment on there. She got a lot of prototype equipment. Okay, everything was just coming on. Here she is doing the promoting of a Sperry gyro pilot system. What do you call that? Autopilot. Thank you. Here's something that she had and took off before she went around the world. There's a little dome on the top of that. Her aircraft at that moment, instead of a traditional loop that Don was going to bring, and this was a traditional or a modern ADF where you just dial in a station and just it gives you a heading and you just fly toward that heading. Well, this guy had it before she took off, but it wasn't reliable, so she took it off and went back to an old-fashioned loop. And he eventually sold it either to Bendix or Sperry, I forget. But the guy's name was Hooven that actually invented the ADF. So, and here's Amelia in the back. That's the Hooven power supply there. Again, she's sitting on top of all her gas tanks. And here, she got a slightly different Western Electric radio or set of radios for her Lockheed Electra, and the HF receiver had a remote head, and that's what she's got in her lap. And this is the head of sales for Western Electric. So he's really happy to have Amelia, taking a picture with his product, his new product. And I think she got a lot of prototypes. She got like serial number 1 in a lot of cases. So she's got a new plane. She's got a new goal. She wants to be the first woman to fly around the world. People are already flying around the world, but this can be news, and she wants to do this one more time, before she retires. So here's the crew that she ended up with. Paul Mance is still in the picture. Okay, he's the guy on the left. There's Amelia. Now, she had met Captain Harry Manning. He was the skipper of the SS United States, which she came back from Europe the first time. It's a cruise ship, so he's a cruise ship captain. But he was he's an overachiever. He's a navigator. He's a radio operator. He loves to take tests and pass tests. And he's going to be her navigator and radio operator. And then Fred Noonan, who came from Pan Am, he came in later. And so we just talked about Paul Mantz. He had commercial and amateur licenses. He's the one that tested those radios over, flying up at 12,000 feet in Hawaii and talking to the states to make sure it was all going to work for Amelia. He was the one that picked up the twin-engine Electra from the factory and learned how to fly it and tried to train Amelia, but Amelia was usually in front of the cameras. Okay, so she was doing what she was good at, and tested the radio equipment and tried to train Amelia. If you read this book goes into great detail. The receiver that Don was going to have here, the Bendix RA1, which you haven't seen yet, it's like 4 pages. The factory rep comes out and trains Manning, and it says, okay, though this dial it says this, it doesn't really mean that. You got to put this dial here, and you got to put this dial down here, right? And if you don't put it, dial 1 or does not match dial 1 on the radio, okay? And so anyway, Manning was the only one that was trained, and what happens, Manning leaves. So, but this is a good book too. And this book also is the main book of the folks that say she ended up in a drink. So. And the other thing was, Paul Mantz was going to fly along only as far as Hawaii, just from Oakland to Hawaii, just to make sure Amelia had it. She's used to the plane. She's got everything pretty well working. And so people were going to drop off as they got farther and farther. And eventually, the goal was that when Amelia landed back in Oakland, or wherever she was going to end back in the States after going around the world, she was going to be alone, okay? So all the crew would have left by that time. So Manning, he's they called him the boy skipper. They got to know each other when they were coming back the first time. He was on temporary leave, so he only had a window, I guess, when they weren't cruising. And they had this special window put in the back of the plane, and that's where the navigator was going to sit. That's optically flat glass there, a special window. No other Lockheed Electra had that window. They needed a radio operator, so he studied up, he went, took the test, and so he's a CW guy, and away you go. So somebody on the plane had to be a licensed radio person. So he was that person. Now, what happened? Manning, they were doing some test flights, and Manning missed an airport by 20 miles. And Amelia got concerned, talked to George Putnam, her husband, and they said, we need to see if we can get one of the best navigators in the business to work with us, the best aerial navigator, and there was only one company doing long-range aerial navigation, and that was Pan Am. And Fred left Pan Am about that time, and they picked him up. A lot of people say that he left because of drinking. I have been researching Pan Am archives, and there was a fellow named H.C. Luderitz that set up their direction finding network, and there's a 2-page thing where basically Fred is flying to Midway or Wake, I forget, from Hawaii. He's 200 miles off. The radio people are telling the skipper, you're 200 miles off, you're passing to the west of the island. Fred says, oh no, I got it. Just we're, headwinds. Give me another 20 minutes. They gave him another 20 minutes. The radio people are still telling him, hey, you're missing it. And the pilot finally said, Fred, are you sure? And he said, oh yeah. And the pilot said, nope, I'm turning right. And he turned right, and within like 20 minutes, he sighted the island, and all is well. and everybody got in Fred's face when they landed, all the big wigs, and Fred left shortly thereafter. So I think the drinking was a cover story, yeah. So, but Fred was no wimp, okay? Fred worked his way up to sea captain. He was on 3 ships sunk by U-boats in World War I. And by the way, there was a lot more ships sunk in World War I than there was in World War II. He had commercial pilot's license. He could run any ship going into any harbor in the world. He was the first navigation instructor and airport facility inspector. He did all the original routes when they went from Oakland to Hawaii to Wake to Midway to Guam to Philippines. All those Fred did, and so anyway, so Fred was picked up. Manning was still there to be the radio operator, and the sort of they were going to work together on the navigation, and but Fred was supposed to depart at Howland Island, which was the next to last. Well, actually, that was the second stop. When they were going, they went this way the first. They went this way the first time, and the second time. But I'll talk about that. So anyway, the plane. Here's the plane. The antenna on the top is your transmitting antenna. The antenna on the bottom is the receiving antenna. Okay, and there was also a trailing wire antenna that was removed. Okay, so no VLF capability. So this talks about some of that, and Don was going to bring a Bendix MM5 loop antenna, so they'd gone back to the loop antenna. The retractable trailing wire was removed, so she did not have good VLF capability to talk to ships, for example. She had a 13C transmitter and a 20B receiver. Let's see if this, and there she is in the cockpit. It had a remote head that was mounted right in the in her dash, and the receiver, I think, was underneath her seat. And here's that's the receiver, except that's the one with without the remote head, the 20A. This was the 20B, so she had that little setup in her plane, and this was her primary HF receiver for communication. And then that was it had like a odometer, cable, like on your bicycle, that went between the two. So, and they were using Morse code at first when they had Manning. Manning set up in the front, and he was using a standard Navy Bendix key, which he had strapped there. And this was during the first time they were trying it. Later, it was removed. So, and okay, the transmitter here's it's a carbon microphone, and if anybody knows about carbon microphones, they don't have the best fidelity. And also this, I believe this was screen modulated as opposed to plate modulated. 3-channel, switchable, and it also had an odometer cable, so you could switch remotely 1, 2, or 3. So it had 3 output stages, 3 different coils. Each one would be tuned up for a certain frequency. 3 crystals and 3 loading coils, and that's what the gentleman from Rod Blockstone has got now. He's trying to fire it up. And one of the reasons why he's trying to fire it up is that some of the people that say they heard Amelia heard her on frequencies much higher than what that transmitter could do. So that was either 3105 or 6210. Well, some people heard her on 18 megs. Okay, so the question is, was that transmitter that nasty, that generating that harmonics, and could those have carried halfway around the world? It was one of the carbon microphones that carried. So the first attempt, they started off at Oakland, Western United States. They were going to go ahead and fly out to Howland, to Honolulu, then Howland, then Leh, and then go around the world and come back and cross the United States. So the first leg would be going from Oakland to Hawaii. And Manning had already talked to the Pan Am folks. He stayed in contact with everybody with CW all the way through, and then they used their radio loop to home in on Oahu. Everything went beautiful, okay? And there were picket ships that the government provided out in the middle of the Pacific to help guide them in with lights, with smoke, with radio signals, and they sort of changed. Like this first time, the Itasca wasn't involved; it was off doing somewhere else. Okay. Manning was the radio guy. He told everybody exactly what he wanted. I want you to transmit, from 1 to 6 minutes past the hour on this frequency, and then send this, and then send that, and everybody knew what role to play, and everybody got the same memo. And most of the time when they were doing radio direction finding, somebody would be sending MOs, which is basically da 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 da. And so it's the closest you can get to holding the key down without burning up your transmitter. So they always talked about sending MOs. So you let the transmitter cool down a little bit, but basically you're sending a bunch of dashes, and so they made it to Hawaii. Great. Now they're getting ready to take off again to the second leg, and what happens is Amelia is flying before Paul Mantz had been doing some of the flying. Okay, and she wasn't as good as him on a dual engine plane yet. She didn't have that much experience, and he was worried about that. In this book you'll read, and she looped it, and luckily it didn't catch on fire, but it took a couple of months to be repaired. Okay, and so once it's repaired, she says, okay, this time we're going to leave from Miami, and we're going to be flying east to west instead of west to east. Now, she did. She said she was going to depend entirely on voice broadcast on 6210 and 3105, and this is internationally, okay, which is not the standard internationally. And her only cargo were something like 8,500 of these stamped covers ready to be sold through gimbals once she landed. And so you'll see a picture of the nose of the airplane here in a little bit. Just imagine 8,500 stamped covers sitting in there. So and so they were going to start at Oakland and then fly over to Miami, sort of as a warm-up flight, and then they were going to go this way on the second attempt. And a lot of this people were already doing, okay? So it wasn't really news per se, but the hardest part was over there from New Guinea, which is above Australia, up to, toward Hawaii. That's the longest leg and the most dangerous leg, because Howland Island is only 2 miles in diameter and hard to see. So there's a lot of questions about who made changes or what changes were made in in Miami. Even the Pan Am folks were working on her plane for her, but Pan Am wasn't using any of the equipment that she was using. So they had their own equipment, and I've got other pictures of that. But as far as we know, they didn't change out any equipment. Now, Don was going to bring a receiver called a Bendix RA1B, actually that I sold to him, and the thought is that was on her last flight, and above her head there is the remote head for the RA1B, and this was a picture taken in Miami. And Don has the receiver at the top. I only know of one person that actually has the smaller remote head. But Don has the RA1B, and it has British Air Ministry markings. So it was a World War II standard receiver. This was 1937, so she had the prototype. And people even argue, was that we got a picture taken in Miami. It shows the thing above her head, but these folks will tell you that receiver was not on board. So, just depends on what you want to believe. So they also messed around with the transmitting antenna. They were trying to get it to cover VLF frequencies as much, and also 3105 and 6210. And the thought was they basically detuned the antenna so it really didn't match on any of those frequencies. Okay, so they made a poor situation worse by trying to make it a universal antenna because she didn't want to do the trailing wire thing and crank it in and out. So
Too much trouble to crank it in and out?
yeah, yeah, that's the and.
It's also aerodynamically risky, especially if it catches on something. Takeoff protection.
That's true. Lindbergh flew some survey flights for Pan Am, and they carried extra weights on the back because they did exactly the same thing. And Mrs. Lindbergh, of course, was the radio operator on all those flights, and using Pan Am equipment, by the way, standard Pan Am equipment. And she's written a couple of good books. I could do another presentation on that, but Charles Lindbergh called his wife the crew. And so, and of course, now one more thing: when they took off at Miami, they didn't need that window anymore. The one where the navigator, they were down to. Manny had to leave because he had to go back to be the skipper of the cruise ship. So all of a sudden now it's Amelia and Fred, and that's it. So they actually covered over that navigator's window on this plane, which is a unique window to begin with. So, keep that thought in mind here as we move forward. So this time the Itasca's off Howland, and various ships, and they don't have, they basically have Navy radios, and for the most part they do well on VLF, and they do well for direction finding on VLF, but not on any of the other frequencies that Amelia is going to be talking on. Now, how many times you've ever been in a meeting where you've got people, everybody didn't come in the meeting, and when you leave the meeting, you know it's messed up. You know it's FUBAR, okay? Everybody know what FUBAR means? Well, this was the radio plan. Again, Manning was out of the picture. It was Amelia and Fred, okay? And I don't know who was doing this, but everybody and their brother are involved in this radio plan, and they're talking about frequencies that Amelia doesn't have. They're talking about taking direction finding on frequencies that the Coast Guard can't do. I mean, it's FUBAR. And so I just want to show you. FUBAR, 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 okay? So everybody had other expectations. No, there was no good plan for everybody to go around the world. So that's a big problem. So they're doing really good. Remember the first picture? They're in Java. 31 legs done, 2 to go. So, and this is the longest flight. She's got the most gas on board. She's taken off from a dirt strip, and they say it was only 50 yards from the end before she made it in the air. So finally, another video. Yay! Yeah.
At 10 a.m. on July 2nd, Amelia and Fred are ready to begin the most difficult part of their flight, from Ley, New Guinea to Howland Island. This grainy film records the last time Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan are ever seen alive. But the footage may reveal something else. Serious damage to plane, unknown until recently.
This is the takeoff from Ley, New Guinea, and it contains an important clue.
Photo analyst Jack Blickman discovered it when he took a close look at that footage.
This is the last film of Earhart, and as the takeoff roll starts, you can see the smoke right there. This smoke comes from rear bottom of the airplane. And in that location is an antenna mast, and that antenna mast appears to have snapped off.
That mast supports the electric main receiving antenna strung along the belly of the plane. Without the belly antenna, Amelia will be unable to receive any radio transmissions. She doesn't know it yet, but she's cut off from the outside world.
This is Amelia. I'm at 8,000 feet. All's good. So she's basically tweeting. Okay, she's just sitting. She's just doing one-way stuff. She doesn't really want an answer back from anybody. She just wants to say everything's good, and here I am. And
Expecting other people to say something.
exactly. Yep.
At dawn, Fred Noonan shoots the sun to confirm the that the electric is on course for Howland Island. On board the Itasca, radio operator Leo Bell is on his headphones, listening for Amelia's call. As planned, Itasca transmits weather reports and A's Morse code to help Amelia get a fix on their location. But with her receiving antenna broken, she never hears them. The Itasca's radio logs reveal her dilemma. She asks them to track her location and guide her in. She whistles into the mic so the Itasca can take a bearing on her. But that wasn't part of the plan, and they are equipped to get a fix on her signal. Miller continues to send on different frequencies, trying to establish two-way communication. But it's obvious that Amelia cannot hear them, and she has no idea that the Itasca can hear her. As time passes, the situation grows more desperate.
It's clear everybody's in real trouble here. This is one of the most famous people in the world. This is Amelia Earhart. Why doesn't she do what we're telling her to do? Why does broadcast when we tell her to broadcast on the frequency we tell her to broadcast on, so we can bring her on in?
Amelia's final message comes in at 8:43 a.m.
We are on 157 337. We are on north south.
Itasca keeps calling and listening, but they hear nothing more. They have to assume the Electra has gone down.
She was so close, and then vanished. If there's a reason why the mystery of her disappearance has been so fascinating, is she was almost there.
They didn't have
and she was readability 5 on a couple of transmissions, which is very loud, in other words. And they said a couple of the guys went out of the radio room and looked up expecting to see her plane at that time because she was so loud. So the clock starts. This is July 2nd, and everybody starts getting notified. And the problem is the Navy, they have they have the Itasca, and then they have a couple other ships hundreds of miles away. No big ships. All the big ships are in Hawaii, and everybody's on R&R. It's not good. Planes are totally taken apart for maintenance, and so there really wasn't a backup plan either from the Navy's point of view. So.
Short time ago, Amelia Earhart checked over every day.
Oh, man. There it is.
This was her greatest achievement, a sky dash of 28,000 miles. With her husband, George Palmerman Wright, she discussed the hazardous course, which had been plotted for her by Fred Noonan, the navigator who had with Miss Earhart upon this great flight. A flight which was mark her retirement to aeronautical research. Then to awaiting world news of disaster as the plane failed to reach tiny Howland Island in the Pacific. A British freighter, the Coast Guard, and the Navy expected the search. The battleship Colorado steaming out from Honolulu under forced draft. From California, the aircraft carrier Lexington, with 3,000 men and 72 aboard, races the Pacific to join the greatest searching party in the history of aviation.
So the reports started coming in, and the first one said the airplane was afloat 280 miles north of Howland Island, which is basically what this book basically says. Hey, the radio's transmission stop, and we think she's northeast of Howland Island, went in a drink. Okay, so that's where they kind of started. So they started. The Itasca was the closest thing, so it was going on all sorts of search patterns, but mostly northeast of Howland Island. They did kind of go to the south too, and then they even went as far over as Tarawa and some of the Japanese islands, which they weren't supposed to go over that way because of the international friction and all that. The Navy sent out a PBY. They had VLF radios. They stayed in constant touch with the Itasca, but they were turned around. They started icing up, and so they went back. But had Amelia had VLF capability, chances were she would have had much better communication. So radio signals start being reported by a lot of different places, and here I'll let you.
As the frantic and fruitless search for Amelia continues, the world may not have heard the last from her. Within hours of her disappearance, distress calls were reported by professional radio operators and later by amateurs with shortwave sets around the Pacific and across the United States. Eventually, more than 100 reports come in, and the Navy's media take them seriously, looking for clues. If Amelia is using a radio, she must be on land. To charge her batteries, she has to run the electric engine. And it can't run unless the propellers are above water. On the night of July 3rd, calls apparently from Amelia are picked up by Pan Am Airways direction finding stations at Midway, Oahu, and Wake Island. When they track the signals to their source, it's in the Phoenix Islands, which includes Gardner, now called Kamikamaroro.
Unintelligible audio, maybe no audio, so it's not like they're sure that these were Amelia, but it was the best that they could hear, and it was on the right frequency. Now, the radio hams had been very involved in the 1935 flight when she went from Hawaii to the States. They were involved, and they got a lot of press. But in 1937, Amelia really wasn't. The ham radio operators were not part of the plan. Okay, but they reported hearing things, and a lot of what, because the press knew them. In fact, they were shown in that video. The press took it as real information. The problem was, when you've got the press sitting there with their cameras, watching you listen, you don't want to disappoint them. Okay, well, that's basically what happened here. And these guys said later, what we told you was bogus. But the problem was, it was the best. It was acted upon, so they searched in the wrong place for a long time based on bad information.
Some of the messages could help pin down Amelia's whereabouts.
This is shortwave listeners.
In Rock Springs, Wyoming, 16-year-old Dana Randolph claims to have picked up a call from Amelia, who says she's on a reef south of the equator. A woman in eastern Canada says she hears Amelia saying the navigator is badly injured. Perhaps the most intriguing report comes from St. Petersburg, Florida. Betty Clank was a teenager in 1937. She often spent the afternoon listening to her family's shortwave radio, which was hooked up to a power antenna. And she kept her notebook handy to jot down the titles and lyrics of songs she liked. One day afternoon, while searching the dial, she hears a familiar voice.
The first thing I heard was this is Amelia Earhart. That startled me. She said it several times. And I recognized that voice when I heard it.
Betty shared her notebook and her memories of that day with Rick Gillespie in an interview to the Tiger Archives. She recalled that she listened for 2 hours as the signal faded in and out, and she took notes on what she heard.
She was hurting, something terribly wrong.
was a voice of desperation of a woman in grave danger. Betty heard the man's voice too. She believes he was injured, and there were sounds of a struggle.
Here, she couldn't make out what he was saying. But you could tell that she was trying to keep him away from the radio. And they grass around, and he could try to get on.
It reads like a modern transcript of a 911 call. There's confusion. There's things going on in the background.
Betty remembers thinking she heard him say New York City, and she wrote that down.
And then she writes something that sounds like New York. There's Norwich City. Where we think the plane landed on the reef is right near the shipwreck, the Norwich City. And so you think of Earhart and Noonan on this island. They don't know the name of the island, and they want to communicate the one thing about this island that is unique and piece of information they can do. There's a shipwreck there, and the name of the ship is the Norwich City.
Betty's notes about rising water make sense if the plane were parked on the reef, subjected to shifting tides. At the time she was listening, it was nearly on the island. The interior of the plane would have been more hot, which could explain the injured man's desperation to get out.
He was so uncomfortable and so miserable that they would just talk. And then he would kind of get out of his head again.
The transcriptions in her notebook give us almost too intimate a picture of what was going on that reef. These people were in horrible trouble.
Some question how long the signals could have traveled thousands of miles to be picked up by a few random listeners in North America.
You're telling me that this young woman, the only person in the entire world that heard those communications, that doesn't seem reasonable or logical to me.
But it is possible. The kind of radio that Amelia had on her plane often created extra signals called harmonics at multiples of the original frequency. Those harmonics can bounce off the ionosphere and travel vast distances. Radio expert Brandenburg believes that Amelia's normal daytime frequency of 6,210 kilohertz would generate harmonics that could reach Betty's receiver.
Those very high frequencies propagate very well. And so the way Betty described the signal, fading in and out, is exactly consistent with the way that signal would behave at that frequency being transmitted from the island.
Finally, the signal faded out completely. The voices were gone.
I don't know how long that's there. I'd say probably, knowing me, I'd probably waited an hour. We never heard anymore.
Betty may be the last person ever to have heard Amelia Earhart alive. And if she really did, chances are good that Amelia was calling from the Aurora.
So that's what we're talking about here for a lot of money. That's why the transmitter is now in hands of a talent engineer here. So he could figure out that transmitter
Is that, 37, July of 37, 1937.
Okay, July what?
2nd, 3rd. Yeah, she went missing on the 2nd around like 8:45 in the morning, and the report started coming in. Well, the whole transcript's in the back of this book, and also all these are on YouTube, so you can watch them. So I don't know exactly what the date was, but where was I going with that? The other thing was, Amelia had a suitcase of personal letters in her house in California that were to be burned if she didn't come back. And in those notes, it says, George, get the suitcase. Yeah.
Did anybody ever find a Norwich City record of the ship to Norwich?
Oh yeah, it was there. It was huge, and you'll see a picture of it here in a little bit. I mean, it hit the island like in 1901, and it's just sitting there. I mean, it looks like a it's a huge ship.
We know what the sunspot situation was.
Bob Brandenburg does. He's been doing that aspect of it for years. There's also this book here, which Rod Blockstone's group is based on. He has a whole chapter about that in this book here, and you're welcome to borrow this as long as you send it back to me. So.
Did Betty report this?
She did not. She did not. She did not report this. The fella in Wyoming did, and he reported her on like 18.1 megahertz. But he was 15 years old. They took but it was just another report, and there was 100 reports coming in, and some of them were bogus. So here's July 9th. This is 7 days after she went missing. The Navy finally gets there with some aircraft. They do a flyover of a whole bunch of the other islands, including Gardner Islands. They don't land though. All they do is they buzz the thing and they look for somebody to come out on the beach and wave. And they didn't see that on any island. And this is what Gardner Island looks like. That's the picture that he took. That's the only known picture. And then this is what it looks like today. Okay. I don't know if that's at high tide or low tide. I would say that's probably at low tide. And but his report, right in the center, it talks about the tramp steamer. And in the paragraph above, it says, "Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering wave from possible inhabitants, and it was finally taken for granted that none were there." Well, Gardner Island had been uninhabited since 1899. So if they saw any signs of recent habitation, it could have been Amelia. Okay, but it could be that it was just she's already out of water. There was no natural water on the island, and yeah. But Lexington shows up, and they do a really good search. And one of the conspiracy theories is that the Japanese ship picks up the aircraft and takes it, and all that. That ship actually joined the search and worked with us. That was the only case of a Japanese ship helping to look for Amelia. And so basically it was the most costly search in history up to that time. They abandoned it on the 19th, so it had gone on for 17 days. And 9 ships and 66 planes were involved. And so George Putnam was not a poor man, so he had his own private search too. He put the word out, "I'll give you, some money if anybody finds of any signs." And so they went around all the smaller islands trying to find, but nothing was ever found. So basically, Fred Noonan was declared legally dead June 20, 1938. Amelia shortly thereafter, and George Palmer Putnam went ahead and published this last book called Last Flight, based on all the telegrams that he had gotten as she went around the world. Now, in 1940, the Brits took over Gardner Island. Everybody was grabbing these little islands and saying, "We're going to grow coconuts." But what they were really doing is they were jockeying for position for World War II, okay? But a work crew found a skeleton, okay? Can you read that in the back? Okay. Human skull, other various bones. Talks about there was also a shoe found, and a bottle, and a sextant box. Sextants. And the sextant box had a serial number, or actually had 2 numbers on it. And he and Gallagher, who was the head of that whole operation to settle that island, he said basically it could be Amelia. And so what happened is he was told to send the bones to Fiji, and a doctor there looked at the bones and decided it was not a European woman. Okay? He wrote a report, he measured all the bones, he wrote all that down. Gallagher came back and died of some kind of flu or something shortly thereafter. The bones disappeared and never have been found, but the report survived. So no DNA evidence, okay? But, and so they've recently gone back and looked at all the bones, and they noticed the fact that she has extraordinarily long arms for a woman. So based on that, they looked at the bones, and basically they say that that there are significant similarities between the measurement of the bones and Amelia's arms based on photo evidence. Okay. Again, it's just more information that kind of points to maybe it was. Now, Fred Noonan taught navigation for Pan Am, and as part of that class in Miami, and as part of that class, gave everybody a sextant. This, there was one that showed up that was donated by a retired Pan Am navigator. Then he went to be a pilot. It went to the Navy Museum there in Jacksonville, Florida, in Pensacola, Florida, and it was in the same range. It wasn't consecutive, but it was in the same range as the box that was found on Howland, on Gardner. Sorry. They also found, they've done a number of expeditions. They found a disassembled pocket knife. Amelia had freckles and didn't like them. They found a broken freckle cream container jar, some bone fragments, a size 9 heel from a woman's shoe, and they said that native women didn't wear shoes. They also found a piece of aluminum and some plexiglass. Now, in 1937, before Gallagher took over, there was a survey by the New Zealanders, and there's the Norwich City sitting there with its back broken, okay? But what, this is usually a cropped picture, but somebody came up with an expanded picture, and it looks like an aircraft strut sitting over here with a circle around it. So that made big news. We even had the State Department saying that they were going to get behind going back to Gardner and doing a search based on this, but nothing ever came of it, and they didn't find the strut. Okay. But so if there is a smoking gun, it might be this piece. So let me show you this video. And we're about done. So.
Very rough snip, yeah.
This side, corn.
You think so?
I don't think here.
Well, I think
it failed along the root line, the big root line here. And one river.
Nice flat here.
These are very precisely.
I measured exactly on 100.
And that's this age. There's a lot of information. And we can learn things about this. We're very interested in exactly where the path was on the airplane. And we want to reproduce those dimensions this airplane. So we're carefully taping off the dimensions of patch as best we can see them from the photograph. On the outside and the inside of the airplane. And then we've also taped off the artifact, various dimensions. So now we can hold the artifact up to the airplane and see what lines up what. It's one thing to just hold the thing up and say, yeah, that looks like it's about right. And it's another thing to quantify it with actual measurement. You know, this is so many inches here, and the same thing on the artifact, if it is.
Never go with it. Short enough.
Things to point out. Not only does everything line up, but we have the structure. Station 307. That is a 8-inch wide channel that just has to line up right. We see impressions of it on the artifact, and we have a rivet damaged, but it pulled out damaged structure. Because there's structure riveted to. And this distance from here to here on the artifact matches the distance from here to here on the airplane. These things that line up and match up don't happen by coincidence. It's just too good. Consider the null hypothesis. That this is not the Chinese heart sign. This has nothing to do with their heart sign. This is a random piece of earthquake that happened to wash on the same Pacific Island where we have so much other evidence that are
So in this radio business station.
Okay. And so thanks. And by the way, I'm a member of the Antique Wireless. We also have a club. You can be members of multiple clubs, okay? And we have a nice meet coming up in Charlotte, March 21 through the 23rd, and you'll see presentations much better than this at that session. And we also have a big flea market and a big auction as well. So you never can tell what kind of strange radio might show up. So the web page is cc-awa.club, which is kind of odd if you're interested. So anyway, that's all I got.
You want to leave that address back up there?
Sure.
Mike come by and take a picture.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Okay.
Yep.
How about that, guy? That's nice.
Thank you.
That's one of the best presentations we've had here in some time.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Just a couple of other little issues. Ken, do you have a treasurer's report?
That's good money.
I got two questions. The other one is, did anybody here heard Jackson would they know about the second? Here. There's books on it. Okay. There's books on it. The one that bothers me more than anything else is who's the Nimitz? Yeah, Nimitz. Frederick Texas, there. He was quoted at one saying something to the press, saying, we know exactly what happened. Okay. And you didn't elaborate. Okay. But she didn't have the gas to get that far. Okay. So that's sort of kind of but you want to believe it, Ray, and there again, go on YouTube, type in media Saipan, and you'll Marine thing. I saw it. And I saw the aircraft. I saw the aircraft burn. I saw this and all that. And get maybe the truth, you know.
It's Chester.
Real quick. Because that's before the next meeting. So November 10th, for those that are interested, we have the class going to be held here 8:30 in the morning for Saturday.
Okay, anything else? So your motion. Second. Very good.
And I got we're up here. You haven't had any on the radio around.